Hey, Tom, have you guys met?
We just met.
We just met. Congratulations.
Yeah.
I'm involved in that to try to talk about another book. Oh, Matt's back working on the bind. Matt's yeah, I saw your brother yesterday. Yeah. Was he drunk? Was he drunk?
Thanks so much for your support. We really appreciate it.
I know, and I know you're good, and I appreciate you getting out of your way. I am too. And the thing is I really want to be there. I really want to be there today.
Koob minutes here.
There's a couple of cherries.
You need a gavel. Okay, ladies and gentlemen.
So nice to meet you. You did all right.
On October the 1st, there will be crystals from the Grand Palace chandelier for sale here at the museum. We own the chandelier. There is a story of the Grand Palace Theater and the chandelier on this wall on the other side. These three will not be for sale. They are among hundreds and hundreds. In fact, 1,900 crystals that have been wired to hang on the community Christmas tree out of the Ferris wheel. If any of you would like to wire crystals onto the big tree, your help would be greatly appreciated. And you can give the ladies at the desk your name and phone number, and they'll let you know. We will have chains of one fall off? Yeah. There will be bracelets, there will be rings, and there will be little goodies like this, and there will be, from the medallion on the wheel, paperweights. They're solid brass. And they have a soft cement center. Anyway, this will be out in the exhibit area. Enjoy looking at them, and we'll see you on October the 1st or thereafter. Gentlemen?
You're not using me. There they are.
I've lost.
Excuse me.
Where's Jim go?
He went up.
Well, we're missing one.
He's right there.
There he is. All right. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Take care.
That's all right. Good morning, welcome again to the museum. And bring you greetings from all of our White River Valley Historical Society, of which we are a part. And remember that we welcome very much memberships in the society and donations. We receive no public funds for this museum. Also, I'd like to express appreciation to Barb and Joe Reich for giving us free rent for the museum. Also, the posters and flyers that you enjoy, quite considerable aesthetic achievements, are done by Sarah and Ann McDowell. And I think they need a compliment for that. Our next program will be the Presleys. One or two are among us today. The Presleys, the Branson legend continues. Have Gary and Pat Presley and Rose Rayanne and Steve Presley. That's next month, October 19th. Put that on your phone calendars right away. Today for our program, we have two informative and entertaining speakers, both of whom you've heard before. Mr. Koob inaugurated our series, the very first program we held. Somebody's pointing to somebody. Oh. Seats. Excuse me. Mr. Koob, Tom Koob, is a noted author of well-documented history and novels, and is from Shell Knob. And we're certainly pleased to greet him again here. Also, Curtis Copeland, who has also appeared before us before, who is a skilled cartographer and knowledgeable folklorist. And he's with the Branson City Engineering Department. So the rest of the time I'm leaving to them, so please greet them.
Thank you, Jim. I'm Tom. This is Curtis. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. Okay, good. It's a little bit of a foggy fall feeling in the air today, eh? Yeah, felt kind of nice. I'm an outlander, but I've lived in the Ozarks for over 30 years, so I like to think that I have the heart of an Ozarker. How many here would consider themselves a hillbilly? Okay, we got a few. How many think that's a negative term? Oh, just a couple. Okay. How many think it's a positive term? Yeah! All right. Well, that's kind of how Curtis and I feel too. There's a duality to this term. A lot of times it is used negatively, but we wanted to find out, where did this term come from? How did it develop? How did that stereotype form? But what are the real people like? And so that's what we studied, and that's why we wrote this book, and we hope we can present some alternative views. Curtis, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that it's been a great journey with this. What we wanted to do was, we live in a day and age that, terms and labels can be used alternatively as a positive or a negative thing. But I personally have been called a hillbilly in both ways, and so I feel like I've got kind of that experience. But and then one thing I want to say to the whole crowd here, especially in Branson, I say this in a lot of my historic speeches or presentations, is that what is the measurement of how much of an Ozarker you are? And Ozarker is a little bit different than the hillbilly term, which we're talking about today, but I really feel like it's a measure of what's in your heart. It doesn't matter if you're an Outlander, Tom, you've been here, you know, you care more about the area and its history than some folks that may have been here for generations. So if anybody ever asks you, this is a common question, so where you're from, if you're from around here, how many generations you go back, well, I don't feel like that's a barometer of how much of an Ozark you are. It's what's in your heart. So I just wanted to throw that in. But like I say, I've been called a hillbilly as a curse word, and I've been called a hillbilly as a compliment. And this book has been a great journey in looking at the roots of where that word came from, and how we can preserve the positive aspects of that, because it is used in this day and age. Unfortunately, that term's used negatively, specifically from outside our region, and it's kind of grouped with other terms that are even more derogatory. So we hope that this book will be enlightening as well as entertaining, and we've worked really hard to visit with some real Ozarkers who call themselves hillbillies, and so I think you'll enjoy the book, and I hope you enjoy the presentation too. So
Thank you. That's our cover. Is that man a hillbilly?
Could be.
Could be. You know, really don't know a lot about him. His name is Sam McDaniel. He was from McDonald County, Missouri. He was a state representative for 2 terms in the 1920s. But I just like this photo. I think it seems like he's got some character, some strength about him, maybe a little bit of wisdom. But he's holding what appears to be a muzzleloader rifle. Looks like a pretty old one. He's got a powder horn. So it's some pretty old objects there. He's standing in front of a rail fence. I just like to think, you know, what is he thinking? You know, what kind of guy really was he? So we're trying to find out. Want to go to the next slide?
yeah.
How many of you have ever been in the Buffalo River area? Ponca, beautiful area, upper Buffalo River area. If you've ever been to Ponca, there's a lot of lines in Ponca to this day. There's a whole lot of them. They were probably the first people that really settled in that area, the Blinds. This photograph is of Trapper Beaver Jim's cabin, which still exists. It's just across the low water bridge in Ponca. Pretty interesting construction. He knew what he was doing. I have a friend, a lady, Wanda Donaldson Valines, or Wanda Valines Donaldson, I should say, who lives in Shellknob. She's a successful real estate agent. She was born and raised in Ponca. So I thought I'd like to know more about Wanda's life. What was her life like? It was a good life. It was a tough life sometimes. Wanda told me, we never knew we were poor. We lived a good life, and I didn't realize we were any different than anyone else until I went to high school in Harrison. I never heard the word hillbilly growing up, but now I know I am a hillbilly. I'm proud that it means I'm honest, straightforward, and tough. I'm proud of my family and my ancestry. So I thought, there's some pretty good, strong character in there. Wanda said she got her first pair of shoes at the age of 9. She distinctly remembers the smell of those shoes, like the mixture of sawdust and kerosene spread on the floor of the general store in Ponca. So it would be easy to make fun of her and say she didn't have a pair of shoes until she was 9 years old. Well, it may have been typical at that time, I don't know. But they had a good life, They worked hard. They had a big garden. They grew and collected wild plants like ginseng. It was an interesting life, a tough life, but a positive life. So I like to think that people like Wanda, who grew up in a tough environment, and maybe they didn't have shoes until they were 9, nevertheless, she did well in life and has been a successful person. So I think she's a good example of that. Where are we going next, Curtis? All right.
So, the image of the hillbilly, or what we know of today as a hillbilly, hillbilly is kind of a relatively recent term, but the characteristics of the original characteristics and descriptions that were more of somewhat of a negative connotation of the hill folks started hundreds of years ago, a couple hundred years ago in the United States. And the first real example of that in print is from a gentleman by the name of Henry Rowe Schoolcraft. Now, Schoolcraft has gotten a lot of press in the last couple of years because 200 years ago it was just the 200-year anniversary of his journey into the Ozarks. So for those of you that don't know who Schoolcraft is, I'll try to do this in a nutshell. But he was from out east, from New York, and him and another friend of his, they actually had gone to Potosi, what we know now as Potosi, to learn about the mining industry in that part of the country. Now Potosi is up just southwest of St. Louis, and for years, for centuries, it's been a location for mining, specifically lead. The French explorers used it, the Native Americans used it to get lead to create musket balls and so forth. So Schoolcraft, he was well educated, went to some very good colleges and universities on the East Coast. His family business was in the glass works, but that kind of failed. But his idea was he had studied and he was very interested in geology. And he thought, well, maybe I can explore the frontier, which was the Ozarks of Missouri, and maybe I can make some discoveries, and maybe I can get me a job with the federal government as their head geologist. So he was 25 years old, a young guy. He knew nothing about the Ozarks. He knew very little about keeping themselves alive. And in November of 1818, they decided they'd take off from Potosi and go find this lead deposit that was rumored to be about where Springfield, Missouri is now, kind of on the southeast corner of town, down on the James River. There was rumor of a lead deposit there. So over 3 months, Henry Rowe Schoolcraft and his buddy Levi Pettibone went 900 miles in 3 months. And most of the time, they were either lost or starving. So a real good indication of how green they were. So just outside of Potosi on their journey, they came to an old hunter's cabin, and the hunter was out hunting, but the wife was at home, and she took one look at their firearms and said, "Y'all are gonna die. You know, you have the wrong piece of equipment to take out a deer or a turkey." So they had a shotgun and they needed a rifle. So this hill lady was telling these greenhorns from out east what to do. But basically, they ran into very few European settlers. European settlement at that time in Missouri and northern Arkansas was just beginning. This was still Indian territory before they got pushed further west. It was Indian territory that was the predominant tribe was the Osage, a very powerful, very aggressive warring tribe. And it was a really difficult time because Delaware, Kickapoo, Cherokee, a number of other tribes have been pushed into the Ozarks. And so fortunately for Henry Rowe Schoolcraft and Levi, the Ozarks is just a hunting ground for the Osage. The Osage make their home camp up south of Kansas City in Vernon County. So they had vacated the area for the winter, fortunately for Henry, or we may not have Henry's journals now. got a little long-winded there. The important thing about Henry Rose Schoolcraft is his journals. He kept a detailed journal of the flora and fauna, all of the types of rocks, the trees, the vegetation, the animals he encountered. But he also documented these early settlers to the hills. Most of these were folks that of Scotch-Irish descent that had come from Appalachia. And that's just kind of one of those traits. It's like, I always think, if they move on because an area is getting too crowded in the 1800s, how can the 1800s Appalachia of eastern Kentucky be too crowded? But these folks liked their seclusion. They knew how to survive on very little. But the deal was, Henry wrote about these folks in his book. He journaled about them, so we have a real good idea of, you know, what they looked like, what they wore, the bear skins on the wall holding oil and different things. We have a really good description of how these folks lived. The problem is Henry Schoolcraft is a little snobby about it. So he's this educated guy from out east, and he painted a pretty grim picture of the early hill folks as uneducated and poor and just rough folks. And so it's real unfortunate because he overlooks how they were surviving out here in this. I mean, this was the frontier. There was nothing. They're living off the land. And not to mention, they saved his behind a number of times. So that's kind of where it started. And then as you get further on into the 1800s, just prior to the Civil War, you start to get these folks that are called Southwest humorists. And when I first heard that term, I think of the Southwest as Arizona, New Mexico, and so forth. Well, that's one thing with history. We always got to think about things in context of that time period. But the Ozarks was the Southwest in those days. It was the frontier. And there's a number of authors that were, and newspaper and magazine publishers from that time that were, most of these were sporting type of journals and magazines, adventure, hunting and fishing and things. And most of these, they would have a comedic character that was repetitious, like Pete Whetstone that was included in one of the magazines, and had kind of a negative image, kind of real backwoodsy and so forth. And these were written mainly by folks that weren't from the region or had any idea about it, but they created this comedy based on that. And so that carried on up into the Civil War period. So during the Civil War period, things changed quite a bit. It was an awful time for our country, but there was an extra level of awfulness around in the Ozarks. So most of your big battles that you hear about happened out east, Gettysburg, Bull Run, where you have troops on each side of 30, 40,000 people. But this was the trans-Mississippi frontier of the United States at that time. And so you had only about 3 significant battles in the Ozarks, and it was just a few thousand on each side. So Missouri came in as a slave state, and Kansas came in as a free state. So that started a lot of hard feelings, a really bloody time, even prior to the Civil War. So that sentiment carried on as in Arkansas and the Arkansas-Missouri border. The Ozarks is such a rugged place, not very many areas to have a big, significant battles, and there weren't many troops. So what you ran into after Pea Ridge and Prairie Grove specifically, when the Union took control of Arkansas, was you had this very bloody period where you had a lot of bushwhackers and guerrilla warfare, where it was either they were either with the Union, the Confederacy, or neither side, and they were preying on women and children and the elderly, and they were driving them from the homes. There was a mass depopulation in the Ozarks during the Civil War. So after the Civil War, and I always like to talk a little bit about this because this is close to home. Whoops, I went back. As the picture here is everybody know what these guys are, don't you? Okay. So these are the bald knobbers, specifically the Christian County bald knobbers. And bald knobbers have been covered a lot. So I want to tell you a couple things that you may not know about them. So number one, what you see here with the hideous mask, those are the Christian County bald knobbers. They were kind of the secondary group. They had a secondary mission. The first group of bald knobbers were formed in Taney County. They didn't wear a mask. In fact, they didn't want to wear a mask. They wanted people to know who they were. Something that's not covered a lot, we do know that, yes, they wanted to assist in local law enforcement. We had one sheriff to cover over 600 square miles. And between the era of, in the 20 years after the Civil War, there's reportedly 30 murders that had gone unsolved or untried. And also what you have going on after the Civil War in Taney County, even with the loyalty acts and everything else, Taney County up to 1884, the county offices were in Southern sympathizer control. And so after the Civil War, you have an in-migration of folks from the north. A lot of them were ex-Union soldiers. And a lot of these ex-Union soldiers were stationed right up the road at Ozark. And their key mission was to come down into Taney County and drive out the Southern sympathizers and Confederate soldiers. So they had a really good idea of the best bottomlands and where the grist mills were located. And they also had heard about a railroad coming to town. And a lot of them thought that it was going to come right through Forsyth. And so, so basically it became, the bald knobbers was kind of an economic and political thing too. So after the 1884 election, Taney County has been Republican and in bald knobber control, and it's remained Republican ever since. But yeah, the leaders of the Taney County, they didn't wear masks. They wanted people to know who they were. They were attorneys, they were businessmen, and then the anti-bald knobbers were, a lot of them, not all of them, but many of them were ex-Confederate veterans and people who had been there for generations prior to the Civil War that had some pretty hard feelings. But the thing about the bald knobber deal and how it affects the hillbilly image is it just, the bald knobber, all the atrocities and violence that occurred during that period was really well publicized in New York and Paris and all the newspapers. So it reinforced that idea that, you know, the hill people are a feuding, violent, rough people. And so it's just, not everything's as simple as at first glance. So, right? And Tom, just holler at me if I go long. I get a little loquacious. So.
Right, so Curtis has done a good job of explaining that through most of the 1800s, information about the people that lived in the Ozark region was promulgated by chroniclers who were outlanders and in general wrote negatively about that. Then a large group of writers, the Southwestern humorists, who were good writers, and what they wrote was funny, but often it was negative. The idea of, you know, the else, the others, you know, making fun of them. And then information like what happened during and after the Civil War, there was bad press for this region, that it seemed to be a lawless, feuding region. And certainly some of those things did happen, but we don't believe that they represent the entire population by any means. Now, the term hillbilly didn't really show up, as far as we've been able to find, until about 1881 in a newspaper report. It's the first printed version of that term that we've been able to locate. So they weren't necessarily making fun of hillbillies, they were just making fun of these people that lived in the hills and hollers of the Ozark Mountains. That term then became more and more used in mass media, newspapers, some books, eventually the movie industry, television, all that. So it kind of developed over time. Now, around the turn of the century, around 1900, there was some interest nationally in looking at rural areas a little differently. People that lived in the cities and the industrial regions were beginning to see the negative impacts of industrialization, very poor living conditions, very poor work conditions. They didn't think it was a healthy environment, and they began to look back at the more rural areas and say, you know, they've got something to offer too. Certainly we need agriculture, but we also need clean air and water. Maybe it's a more pristine, bucolic way of life. And there was a lot of interest, a romantic interest, let's say, in rural living. Now, maybe one of the best examples for the Ozarks is this person who I know you all know, Harold Bell Wright, who published his novel, one of his many novels, The Shepherd of the Hills, in 1907. You all know the story. He stayed in the area. He wrote a very, very popular book, and he was, for the most part, quite kind to the people that lived here. He wrote in a very romantic style, which was typical of that day and age. He had his good characters and his bad characters. It's a bit moralistic, but a lot of people read it, and a lot of people liked what they read, and of course, they came here. And you all know that story of what happened. But it was the beginning of what we can call the country life movement. In fact, when Teddy Roosevelt was president, he appointed a commission called the Country Life Commission to look at rural living and see what could be done to improve conditions and to encourage that way of life. You know, the federal government was going to come in and tell these poor farmers what they need to do to get their act together. I guess. You know, I'm sure they meant well. I'm not so sure how well it was always received. But there was a little bit of shift right around the turn of the century toward this more romantic view, and that seeing that there is some positive characteristics. Opposed to that, however, were these continued mass media depictions. Some of the worst were in the very early movies, films that were made. A lot of these were produced in the early 1900s, when they were silent films. They started out, and there was a lot of the so-called hillbilly movies, and they used the typical ridiculous traits, and they just turned these things out in droves, and apparently people went to see them. So again, they were picking up this negative perception. Are we at Randolph already?
No.
I gotta check my notes. Yeah, we can move on, I think.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about Made in the Ozarks too, a little later.
Oh.
Pick up on that.
Yeah, I could mention an hour. I could pick it up later.
Yeah, we'll pick it up later.
Okay.
That'd be good. So, all right. So Vance Randolph is the individual seeing this picture right here. Who all has heard of Vance Randolph? Yeah, pretty good amount of you for sure. So this guy, in my opinion, had the dream job. He got if one of the Ozarker traits is either you can tell a really good story, a big windy or tall tale, or you really like to listen to him. And I find myself in that second category. I could sit and listen to an old timer tell stories all day. But this gentleman, Vance Randolph, came on the scene in the early 20th century. The 1920s to the 1940s and 50s was kind of the apex of his career. But he was another outlander from Kansas, like Tom Koob over here, that fell in love with the Ozarks at a young age. And so he was a collector of Ozarks folklore and folk songs. He is quite a complicated and complex individual too. He collected volumes, thousands of folk songs and thousands of folk tales and stories and superstitions. But he's probably most well known for his best-selling book that came out years later in the 1970s when the publishers of the big book companies kind of loosened up their moral standards a bit. And I'll let y'all research that a little bit, but he felt like every aspect of human life in the Ozarks was important, so he collected it all.
Was that Kissing in the Snow?
That's the one.
All right.
Yeah, that's the one.
Sorry I had to say that.
Yeah. Trying to be politically correct here. You can take it down and say it. But anyway, so during this time period, you've got a couple things going on. You've got folks that are interested in capturing the realism, and also the folks that are doing this thing called boosterism. And Branson is daily we have examples of Ozarks boosterism occurring around us. Vance Randolph and his contemporaries were in this interesting time period where the Ozarks recently, as you know, at the turn of the century, 15 years before, we got our first major railroad come through. We're starting to get the automobile, and those people who have an automobile want better roads. And tourism had already been in place, so the outside world was starting to infiltrate into the Ozarks. There's better communication, better transportation. And Randolph and some of his contemporaries saw this, and they saw a danger in it because their vision or their view of Ozarks culture was a traditional Ozarks culture kind of between the time period of the Civil War and World War I, World War II. And that's kind of where we get this iconic hillbilly image with the ladies in the bonnets and making lye soap and guys like Sam McDaniel. You know, that's kind of that time period. And but also from that we get a lot of unique things out of the Ozarks region. The music, obviously it started in Appalachia, and before that it started over in the old country. But the Ozarks itself had its own group of individuals making this wonderful folk music. And then the folk tales, of course. So Randolph was capturing what he felt like was the real Ozarks. And the problem with that, at that time period where he started butting heads with individuals, was that there's two types of Ozarks boosters, and I'm going to talk about both. But the first one were really concerned about some progressive economic development. And you have an individual up in Springfield at the same time as Randolph was around by the name of John T. Woodruff. And how many of y'all have heard of Route 66 or Table Rock Dam? Okay. Even prior to Route 66, there was a highway plan called the Ozark Trail that John T. Woodruff was instrumental in, along with Harvey Coyne and a couple other big names of that era. But he was instrumental in Route 66. You know, Springfield, the birthplace of it. John T. Woodruff was also instrumental in helping with Table Rock Dam and so forth, some of the early discussions of it. So he thought that Randolph and Randolph's friends, Thames Williamson and Harold Bell Wright, were just awful. He thought that the writings were awful. He thought that it made everybody from the outside that might come here to develop and in the Ozarks and the Springfield area would think that they don't want to come down here. We're just a bunch of dumb hillbillies. Thanks to this image that is being perpetuated by Randolph and also Harold Bell Wright, even, which poor Harold Bell Wright, nice guy, you know. I mean, I can see it. Randolph's, at least he's a little bit ornery. He might deserve some of that, but anyway, another individual I want to talk about. Okay, so Mary Elizabeth Mankey. Has anybody heard of Mary Elizabeth? Yeah, she's a pretty neat lady. So she was also kind of like Vance in that she was preserving this realistic view of the Ozarks and the hill people. So interesting thing about Mary Elizabeth is her dad, her father Alonzo, was pretty much the second in command for the Taney County Bald Knobbers. Really interesting individual. He had the Taney County Farm and Home newspaper. He was a newspaper guy. He also helped start the University of Arkansas. Go Hogs. And but Mary Elizabeth, she was a neat woman herself, and she also had a really neat son by the name of Doug Mankey. I mean, there might be a few old timers around here who remember Doug. Really neat guy. I had the pleasure of meeting him one time. I don't think he could see or hear me, but I was really honored to meet him. He was quite the Taney County historian. He really was. But Mary Elizabeth, so like I mentioned, her father, Alonzo, had the newspaper there in Forsyth. And early on, she was a brilliant writer. So at 14 years old, he let her write articles for the newspaper. And back in those days, and even these days, a lot of the rural newspapers, what's left of them, have country correspondents that will write little blurbs about things that happened in their neighborhood during that week or month, whenever the paper came out. And so she was a country correspondent for her father's newspaper and then other newspapers over time. Now, Mary, her dad was kind of nomadic, so she traveled around a lot. And so was her husband, Charles, now C.P. Mankey. And so, fortunately, they pretty much stayed around. Her and her husband stayed around Taney County, but they migrated around a lot. Some of it was due to factors out of their control. For instance, how many of y'all have heard of Melva, the town of Melva? Okay.
Something happened there, didn't it?
Yeah. 1921. Melva's right where is it called Buffalo Ridge golf course is down south of town, right down there on the railroad. In 1921, tornado came through and wiped out the town, wiped it off the map, and it never rebuilt. Real tragedy, real tragedy. Turkey Creek runs right through there, and several school kids were not killed by the tornado, but they were blown into Turkey Creek, which was flooded, and
including one of Mary's children.
One of Mary's sons. But they had a general store in Melva, so then they moved on, and I get my chronology a little bit out of whack. I need Angel Wolf or Tammy Morton here, but
they moved around a lot.
Yeah, they moved around a lot. Went on down to Oasis, and then here comes the lake. Oasis is, I don't know, 196 feet below the Long Creek Bridge, something like that.
When you're driving over the Long Creek Bridge, if you look off to the north, you'll see that island there. And just at the foot of that island was the beautiful little town of Oasis, where the Mankeys ran a general store and the post office for several years. So, interesting place.
Yeah, but like I mentioned, she wrote about things that were happening in her community, and even though her family, she came from a well-educated family and so forth, she had been in the Ozarks long enough that she started to adopt some of these hillbilly traits. She believed in a lot of the Ozarks superstitions, believed in a lot of the Ozarks ghost stories, but also all of the gardening and farming and sewing and carding and spinning wool and all the different things. And she was on that cusp, that transition from where you got the old ways in the Ozarks and the new modern ways. And so she wrote about those things, and she also wrote about them in poetry, and she became very well known for both. She was nationally recognized as a newspaper correspondent, and she was also nationally recognized as a poet laureate of the Ozarks.
Give us an example, Curtis.
Yeah, here's a great example. So this one's called Service, and it says, "When they put me away in my silken scarf, my beads and thin worn rings, will they think of my old wash tub, my broom and other things? The little hoe I kept for flowers, the basket for dead leaves. No one will use them anymore, and so my spirit grieves." So she just did a lot of wonderful poetry too. I encourage you all to look into that. And if I got time,
I'm sorry.
hey, it's good to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leon.
Yeah.
So was she a hillbilly?
Yes. No, maybe.
If she is, she's certainly a great example of positive attributes. Wonderful lady. Yeah, if you ever get a chance, there's her biography, A Candle in Her Soul, by Ellen Gray Massey, is a wonderful read, as is any of Mary's poetry.
Okay, so if we got time, I'd like to talk about one more Ozarks booster, and nothing is ever simple or cut and dried. But I've mentioned one type of Ozarks booster that was really interested in promoting economic growth and development. But there's another kind of Ozarks booster, and his name was Otto Rayburn. And you're going to see a pattern here. Another outlander from Kansas comes down here and falls in love with the Ozarks, and he made it his life's passion. And this must have been the most tragic, conflicted individual. He loved the Ozarks. He was like Vance in that he collected Ozarks folklore and folk songs. Him and Vance were close friends. Otto, I feel like, was kind of the nice kind of romantic type of writer and really nice guy, whereas Vance was a little more rough around the edges. But Otto, both of those guys had a real difficult time making money. But Otto started several magazines over his lifetime, starting in the 1920s when he was in education, and he found himself in a little town called Kingston, Arkansas, which is really close to the Villines territory, down there near the Buffalo River. And he started a little magazine down there, and he wanted to capture old folk songs and folk tales and so forth. But he didn't have a whole lot of readership, and this pattern continued. He eventually wrote a book called Ozarks Country, which is a really good book. It's got a lot of his kind of flowery language in it. What kind of happened to Rayburn is why I feel like he is probably conflicted is he eventually made Eureka Springs, and he had a somewhat successful magazine called the Ozark Guide. And there's still enough of those floating around, you've probably seen them. But he had to start soliciting advertisement from real estate agents and from a lot of folks promoting the very thing that he was trying to protect and preserve. And he even at a time got so desperate that he had to take on a real estate license himself. Let me read a little bit about a quote here from Rayburn. This really gives you a good idea how he felt about his beloved Ozarks and the Hill people and his image of them. It says, "Folks who read books and work with machines think of the Hillman as backward, but that is a mistake. When I came to the Ozarks, my ability to quote Shakespeare, conjugate verbs, and work cube roots did not help me one bit in locating a bee tree or in taking a boat over the Wildcat Shoals. My book knowledge wasn't worth a tinker's dam for practical purposes. I was the backward one, not my neighbors. I would gladly have traded some of Plato's philosophy or Tennyson's poetry for the art of gigging fish in swift water, but no deal. The Hillman matched his environment. I was a misfit. But through perseverance, I have learned some of the arts and skills of hill life that have added to my enjoyment. If I ever enter the state of reincarnation, I ask that the fates that be to favor this one request: make me a hillbilly."
What's next? What's after that? Yeah, I want to hit her first.
Okay, yeah, May Kennedy.
Queen of the Hillbillies. Did radio shows in Springfield and St. Louis for many years. I think in probably the 30s to the 50s, maybe a little bit off, but in that time frame. Had an article in the Springfield paper for many years. She liked to write about particularly the people. And she would have people call in or write into her and tell little stories and tell about their lives. And that's what she talked about. She really loved this region. She was a talented musician, recorded a lot of the old traditional music. She was a big supporter of the Ozark fairs and music shows that developed in the area, starting probably in the 1930s and continue to this day. May really loved the area. She loved the people of the area. She was a great person. there she is sitting on her front porch playing her old black guitar. Pretty neat.
She was a defender of Vance Randolph too.
Yeah, she worked with Vance and Otto Rayburn and many of the other people that, Mary Elizabeth. In fact, they were some of the original members of the Hillcrofters. Is that right, Curtis?
Yeah, they're some of the
Yeah.
founding members of the Hillcrofters.
Yeah.
Back in '31. So.
And now we have a new Hillcrofters.
We do.
Right.
Reborn.
Right. So May was a if she is a hillbilly, she was a great hillbilly, a great example of the strength and talent and character, I think, of people that live in these hills and hollers. But quite opposite that is the
the
previous slide.
Yeah.
All right, so May was the real deal, but unfortunately, mass media didn't get it for the most part. They were still producing these horrible movies, writing some pretty good novels and some really bad novels, and occasionally a play. And the worst play, probably the worst play ever produced, according to the critics, was Made in the Ozarks. But this thing was popular. And this play was performed from Los Angeles to New York for many, many years. It's awful. It's an awful stereotypical presentation. Your typical baloney, a lot of scatological humor, sexual innuendo. It's awful, and I don't want to talk about it anymore.
Okay. Tell us how you really feel. Right. Let's talk about some music.
Yeah, who's got music?
Oh, you got music. You're the music man.
Well, we'll try a little bit. Yeah, you can't talk about the Ozarks and not talk about music, because it's always here, still here. A lot of the people that came into this area, a lot of them were of Scotch-Irish ancestry. Certainly not all of them by any means, but a lot of them were. They were of a Celtic or Gaelic tradition. They came to the United States, or they came to this country. They moved into the Appalachian regions. They liked those mountainous regions. They eventually moved to the Ozarks. They liked our mountains, and they brought their music with them. A lot of it was really old traditional songs that had come from the British Isles originally. And some of that is still around. But over time, that music gets changed, just like every other culture or art form. There are outside influences and things change. For pretty much all of the 1800s, of course, the music was at the play parties, out on the front porch, maybe at a square dance or a jig party. That's where the music was, and that was pretty realistic music. But then by the time you come into the early 20th century, there begins to be this influence of outside music, even eventually to radio and television. So music develops. In the 1920s, there was a music company, or there were several actually, that were interested in what we might call real generically country music. Sometimes it was even called race music. And they began going around in the Appalachians and the Ozarks looking for talented musicians. And they found a lot of them. And one group was these guys from Virginia that they kind of put together in the studio, and they were talented, and they played what they called country music. But during the recording session, Ralph Peer, who worked for OK Records, he said, "Well, what is your guy's name?" And their response was, "Well, we're just a bunch of hillbillies from Virginia, so you can call us the Hillbillies." One of the first references to hillbilly being used in country music. And you can see there a little bit of a stereotypical image. It's funny because there's another image in our book of the same guys, but they're dressed much differently, quite nicely, and one of them's on the piano, and it's a completely different image, so it's kind of interesting. And they didn't know what to do with these guys, but they did know that the music they could play was good, and people liked it. So it really took off, and then there's this long history right up into where we are today of this type of music developing. Of course, it's changed a lot. I always encourage people to really try to find that real traditional stuff, because boy, it's getting really hard to find. but I know it's still out there.
You kind of described that description that they really don't know what to do with these guys, but they play really good music.
Yeah.
I think you're describing the Missouri boat ride.
So did I skip one?
Yeah, let's talk about
We skipped over Maeve? Yeah, we got that.
No, we got May. Let's just real quick, the Weaver brothers and Elvira, because they're from up at Ozark, just up the road. So we can you want to talk about them just real quick?
Yeah, the Weaver brothers, a couple guys from Ozark, Missouri, learned music at an early age, were good at it, kind of made and played their own instruments like the musical saw. They formed a touring group called the Weaver Brothers, and Elvira was married to both the brothers. Not at the same time.
Different times.
Different time. But somehow it worked out. They did a great combination of music. Maybe it was hillbilly music, but it had a lot of other influences. They had costumes, and they started doing quite a bit of comedy in their routine. And it was quite successful. They toured internationally with this show, and they made movies and did records. So some local folks who did really well. But I think they were one of the early groups that took this somewhat traditional music and portrayed it as hillbilly or Ozark music. And they added this comic element. It was pretty lighthearted, and people liked it. But that addition of music and costumes and comedy really developed over time, as we all know, and you still see it in Branson today. But they did a good job at it. We got maybe about 5 minutes or so.
Oh, right. Well,
here we go.
how many of y'all have seen these type of postcards around town?
What do they call that?
The hillbilly postcards and the hillbilly calendars. So I remember these from when I was a kid, and they've been around since the 1960s. And this is a really interesting story behind these postcards and calendars. So you've got, you know how you have intentional kind of communities, and there's also what I would call intentional hillbillies. So we saw some of this back in the 70s with the Back to the Landers, you know, people coming from the urban areas, specifically young folks, you know, from like your generation, Tom, and that wanted to get out of the urban areas and come down to the Ozarks and try to live off the land. And so that they would refer to things like the Foxfire books. Y'all remember the Foxfire books? Those were like Bibles to those Back to the Landers. They were trying to live like the original hill folks.
Let me interject real quick.
You're a real one. So.
Missouri had their own, the Bittersweet series, and it's still around. They did kind of the Foxfire thing and did a really nice job at it. Mm-hmm. And was that Ellen Gray Massey?
I believe so, yeah. And she collected.
Anybody help me on that?
I think it was Ellen Gray Massey, and she also collected a lot of that from students and people in the area too.
Yeah.
And she also did a fantastic book on Mary Elizabeth Mankey, if you want to read about her. But anyway, so here's another example of intentional hillbillies, what I would call. But this is the Seaton family. Does anybody in here remember Bruce or Dorothy Seaton? Ken does, way back there. I figured you would. You probably worked with them back in the day. But so in a nutshell, so Bruce was kind of an iconic figure. Even if you don't know his name, you've probably seen his picture. He is the iconic Preachin' Bill character from Shepherd of the Hills, the theater and the play.
He played that role for sure.
He played that role. And his wife, Dorothy, such a sweet little lady, real quiet, but she taught me and probably hundreds and hundreds of other people how to square dance, because she was in the Shepherd of the Hills play for decades as well, in the square dance scene. And but anyway, Bruce, you know, he was an educated guy, and they had traveled around. He was in agriculture, like at a scientific level. I mean, sharp guy, but his roots were from down around in Stone County, Missouri. So when him and Dorothy got together, they each had some kids, and they ended up with, when they got together, they had a whole slew of them, like a Brady Bunch type of deal. When they came back to the Ozarks in the early 60s, like right at the height of everything going on, where you got the Volnauer music show and
Silver Dollar
City, Table Rock Lakes just constructed. So one thing about Bruce is he was an entrepreneur. He was a pretty inventive guy. And so one of the things was there was, I think it was Noah Frederick was a newspaper guy in Stone County way back in the 60s. And he had told Bruce, he knew that Bruce was working for Shepherd of the Hills. He said, hey, like most people that work at Shepherd need a day job too. So he said, come on down this new place called Silver Dollar City. They got a bookstore, and you know something about printing. So why don't you run the print shop? Anybody remember the print shop and bookstore at Silver Dollar City? I love that place. Well, anyway, Bruce had all these kids. So he got some of the older kids. They dressed them up. He dressed them up in shabby clothes. Now Bruce was dressed up in a real nice, like 1800s, like print shop operator outfit, and these kids were dressed all shabbily, like hill folk.
That's Bruce right there, right?
Yeah.
And that's Dorothy, right?
Yep. And I'll explain that. Dorothy's about this tall, maybe. And I'll explain how that happened. But anyway, so the kids would go and sell these newspapers. They printed these daily papers, and I think they still do. You know what's going on in the city that day, and they'd sell them for 10 cents, and they get a penny. The kids would get a penny a piece. And Steve, the oldest, I believe Steve's the oldest boy. Yeah, he said that he saved up enough pennies to buy a bicycle at the end of the year. But anyway, so somebody, I forgot how this went, but somebody said, hey, you know, Bruce, if you got the whole family together, you guys, these make great postcards. So they just ran with that, but it was a total family affair. And Bruce, he designed all the sets. Lots of interesting stories that you can read about in the book about the different things they do. But what I want to say here, there's two things about this picture I want to show. When I talk about intentional hillbillies, this shack that you see here, they lived in that for 9 years. That was their home for all those kids. And they, the main thing was they did have TV, but Bruce's rule was no TV, no nothing till the chores are done, and we all sit together and eat together and talk about our day together. That was the number one thing. And they never wanted any kind of assistance, They lived kind of somewhat, you know, they didn't have a lot of money. The one other thing I want to talk about this picture, so little Dorothy, so Bruce had put a fence post in and put a 2x4 across the top. He's laying across the top of that, and she moved up underneath it.
And Dorothy's standing in front of it. So she's not really carrying it.
So they lived it because they had to. They just didn't have a lot of money, but they also promoted it too. So with that, I need to move on.
So I think what's interesting here, these are local folks. We interviewed Steve and Benny and Mark, and great folks, and they've done very well for themselves. Oh boy, I don't think we're going to have time.
Yeah, probably not for the names.
But maybe we can kind of wrap up here.
It's in the book.
With the, yeah,
we don't want to ruin it for
with
you.
the scenes, because on one hand, when you look at their calendars, you go, oh, that is so silly and stereotypical and ridiculous. It doesn't really represent life. Maybe it's some really extreme view, but it's that dichotomy of what is some promoted. It's comic, yes, it's kind of silly and maybe a little bit of fun, but also that difference between what sometimes is displayed and what the reality is. And that's what we hope we've been able to capture in our book, is that there is some different ways to look at things. And please at least consider both before you make up your mind. And before you call someone a hillbilly, know what you're talking about and know what are you trying to say, and do you really know what you're talking about. So that's what we've tried to talk about here today. Thank you for your attention. I hope you've enjoyed it.
One quick question.
Go ahead.
Okay, another show of hands. Who thinks they're a hillbilly now? All right, good. If that's the case, we'll do it.
Thank you very much.
our speakers are willing, the program is ended. However, if you can stay around, they may be willing to listen to your hillbilly stories a few minutes and ask some questions. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim.
Remember, the books are on sale. They're happy to autograph them. Also, picking up on one thing they said, if you look at our front window, you'll see the furnishings of the post office at Notch, Missouri.
Oh, okay.
There is a section in your book that describes all that. It's probably Scotch Irish. Hill meaning mountains, as in Scottish Highlands. And Billy being a shortened version of William. It's a common name, and there's several other associations. Generally, we would say probably originated as a Scotch Irish. Thank you. Thank you, ladies. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for doing it. Thank you. Thank you very much. Glad you did. Thank you.
Got some tobacco. Now, I'd heard of some of those early day guys because I did a lot of reading when it first came down here.
I think he could possibly get it. Oh, perfect.
My name's Captain.
You should be.
Hi, Tom.
Hey,
How are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Where's your
Yeah, right. Good to see you. Where you live? Thank you very much. Yeah, probably good there. You want to sign up to somebody? Sign our name? Larry and Judy? I think I missed it on there.
They had people come for church. It's when you sing that song. It's fantastic.
J-U-D-Y.
They don't.
Yeah.
When somebody says that name is that song.
Curtis, maybe.
He's right there. I'll get into it.
Nice sailor. Thank you very much.
Great job.
Hey, I think Curtis maybe was really drunk too.
He's right there. Yeah, he's right there. The boat ride. Yeah, he tried to get it from the police.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, Curtis mentioned it. Do you want to do a little? Hello. Thank you very much. Okay, yeah. I don't know how you're going to join. You might let this clear out just a little bit. Is that if that's okay? And we'd be glad to do it. Would you like me to sign it? Would you like me to sign it to someone? You just want to sign our names? Thank you very much. Would you like me to sign it to someone? Sign our name? Oh, Curtis already got it. How about that? Hope you enjoy it. Thank you. We bounced around a lot. There's a lot of material, so hopefully I have some fun. We'll see what happens. We already started on another one. we'll see how it goes. Eventually, yeah. I just picked these up yesterday. It just finished the first batch yesterday. But yeah, we'll get in some other details and we'll get on, we'll get on that and take some look. It'll be out there. Well, thanks for coming. Thank you very much.
I need to decorate my second room.
Yeah, they're going to do a little interview. Is that okay?
They're probably going to make me sad.
Well, thank you. Thanks for coming.
Change out there this way.
Did I miss out on an opportunity to purchase the book? Yes, they have some out front. You can buy it from the museum and we'd be glad to sign it. Would you like me to sign it? Could I sign it to someone? Sally? Oh. Well, can I just go down below here? Okay. All right, thank you. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, what's fun to do? There's a lot more stuff in there. Some pretty gritty stuff. Would you like me to sign it to someone? Just sign our name. He's the tall guy. Thank you for coming.
You ever heard of Omaha, Arkansas?
Oh, yeah. Railroad was there at one point.
I lived there for about 3 years. You know what I figured? I found it out. You believe everything they say, they think you're a fool. You call them a liar, they'll fight you. If they can beat you out of something, that makes them the better man. They go to church on Sunday.
Yeah, there's some contradictions out there.
Hate your guts. But they're mad, they want us to like them.
They put the new highway in, that patch on the farm. Used to be on the main drag.
So you want to hear the other side of things.
You gotta look at it. And I think we've tried to look at both sides. Want me to sign it? Should I sign it to someone? He already took care of that. That's for his, I think. Thank you. Thank you.
Why?
Pretty stuff in there. And some good photos too.
Nothing wrong with me. I heard with me when I was in high school.
That looks like a homemade sweater.
Let me see how good
You all take care.
Table, at the dining table.
Thank you very much.
As you came.
Say that again. What is it?
And it is
He's at the table.
Branson
Oh, is he? Okay.
and my ancestors who settled here in the 1840s.
Did you all find a set of chairs?
Generation on this side.
Did you finally get a chair?
Yeah, we did. We were over there. We had a good spot. It was really good.
History of this area.
All right, well, look at it. Thank you. You need a signature?
I do.
Did you get Curtis?
Already got
Oh, you're way ahead of me.
No relation to him, but you're also Copeland.
And that's something.
But he's a Copeland from Lincoln's, Missouri.
I was born over here taking
Oh, yeah?
82 years ago.
Trying to save the bridge, aren't they? Yeah.
I drove across that bridge so much time to think, should I be doing this?
Yeah, what were you driving? Not the big vehicle, I don't.
Just a regular sized car.
I know.
It was sure who's been.
I've done the same thing.
Go around it though.
She's new here, we've been doing it a few years, but basically she can't hardly play chicken, so I need to have
It's really sad what it is now. Ohio's still kind of, they got the music thing going on over there. It's something.
You know, I remember my first 3 years of school, 5.
Oh, yeah? Not the rock building there now. There was another one across the street down a little ways maybe?
Yeah, the school was about probably a mile south of there.
Oh, okay. Oh, wow.
And my mother was a teacher, she taught for 30 years. When we were in school.
Have you ever been to the Berry County Museum?
He's the keeper of the calendar.
They've done a really good job.
Graduated from Jacksonville High School, valedictorian.
Yes, this is the one. No, I haven't seen it.
They got thousands.
This is September, isn't it?
There's so much rich history here.
There is. There's a ton. There's 1,000 stories, and hopefully we got to tell people.
We appreciate it. I enjoy it.
He says, I do that.
Yeah. We retold quite a few stories, but I think we got some kind of not so well known ones too.
Hi, how are you?
Police officer in Springfield for 26 years.
Oh yeah.
In fact, in 68, when she was 62.
Good. You look good. Take care of yourself.
Not bad, huh?
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for doing this. This is really fun.
I hope you enjoyed the book. There's some more stuff in there.
Thank you. Excuse us.
I wish I got here on time. Well, you read the book. You'll
Well, thank you, sir.
You want me to sign it? Yes, please.
You betcha. This is,
Good Curtis is out. Okay. You want me to sign it too? Just sign it.
Mom and Dad. Lloyd, Mercy.
Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy it.
I did, thank you.
Hi, glad to see you. Yeah, I know I enjoyed it. Well, thank you. If you like the Ozarks, I think you will.
She would.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming out today. Good, watch out, chairs. Yeah.
This is
in the same place. Take care.
Oh, okay.
I'm waiting for Bob.
We had our son and daughter graduate the same year, but there were so many connections.
We needed a little more white space.
Yeah, next time you make that.
Well, in most of my books I do. I have quite a bit of space, but it's something I overlooked, I guess. Live and learn. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy it. I hope your son enjoyed it. Happy birthday.
Okay.
Oh, thank you. Curtis, yeah, you got Curtis.
He's very well. I enjoyed the music part. So Wayne Glenn did talk on Ozarks music.
Oh, he knows a lot of stuff. Quite a bit more in there. Of course, it's a huge topic, but we try to add these things in. But unfortunately, we had to skip the May brothers, and that's a great Branson story. Yeah. I interviewed Bob, he's a really neat guy, yeah. And they did a lot for him, they really did.
I'm looking forward to reading that.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Hello. You want me to sign it? I'd be glad to. Looks like you already got Curtis.
He can't, this old carpet loves it, so it hangs on.
Yeah. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Enjoyed it. Thank you. Thanks for coming out.
Oh, you got it. All right, good job.
Anyone can hear us. They've already heard us.
You got write your names down in the radio station.
All stuck up.
Those that to keep somebody dripping over the floor kind of thing.
Downstairs, please.
She has a way of saying it.
You can come.
She says
Okay,
please.
okay.
But you know she could just as soon leave.
Thank you. Shell Bob.
What's a good
How
program?
are you with that signal? Look, it's on my phone. You can run on your Wi-Fi.
That's all right, I got a squeeze you.
Well, I can't say I live in Tulsa.
I know, but
I'll try to work
it's only 3 hours.
And it goes to Kansas City. If I plan ahead, I can make it. Keep up the good work.
Can I get on the internet?
The owner.
Is there any internet?
No. I turned my phone off, so I didn't hear it. She wanted me to save her seat, but I noticed she didn't show up, did she? I figured something came up.
Kansas City, how can
The Newstown number is.
They can buy it here, right now, it just came out, so they can buy it here at the Branson Museum, or they can contact me through email, and I can tell them how to get it. Should that be okay? Let me write it down for you.
They were thrilled to be
Phone number.
Yeah, she was telling me about some photography she has from Mark Trimble.
Okay.
That is the original of one of your shots back there. She's got it on a disc, full color of it.
This was before camera phones.
This is mine.
And she said she's got.
Let me write it down.
She's gonna try to.
I was gonna keep
write it
that.
on?
I don't know if she's gonna.
I think
Who's Jason? What's his face?
I'm not
Well, good.
And
I don't remember his last name.
anyway,
Altman.
Rick's not done.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see how that goes.
Thank you so much. We appreciate
It's gonna be 95.7 FM.
Maybe I'll try to see if I can get that out of Kimberly, 95.7.
And it's
But
gonna
sometimes they
be,
get Eureka Springs.
You might also join the AM station, because it sometimes.
we're gonna be on this Saturday morning at 9 AM.
Okay.
We'll also send you.
Okay. So you're gonna record a program and broadcast it? Okay.
Do we have your?
Yeah, she got it.
Oh.
Mona and
Lana, it's like Donna.
Mona. And would you write her name down?
KCAS with Jim Barker, and I'm going to let folks know that the book is available here. So,
We need to get started, so
if you,
we'll add her when
Yeah.
it gets, because
Yeah,
this is
just-
highly edited.
I'll pick it up and bring it to her soon. Yeah.
consider allowing me to do her signing. Okay.
Real close to your chin.
Yeah, if, okay, well, why don't you look at your calendar?
Yeah, glad to be here. Thank you, ladies. This is an interesting material for you. What's that? You know, I have a face for radio. I meant a voice for radio. Or I can even go a little
Patty,
lower.
are you Gus? Gus?
Yes.
I'm gonna run. folks asked me, I said, well, they're telling me, oh, we're going to do pictures this week, that we're going to have a very interesting interview for you today in the junior. Well, I have a couple of fellows with me right now that are authors that have just written an incredible book. It is called Ozarks, Hillbillies, Stereotypes, and Reality. And I'm going to start out with Tom. Tom Koob.
Koob.
Tom, now remember this time. Tom Koob. And Tom, welcome to the Branson Show.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Happy to be here.
You know, we were just so thrilled to attend this lecture at the Ozarks Centennial Museum here at the Branson Centennial Museum here in Branson. Let me start that again. At the Branson Centennial Museum, right here in Branson. It's a wonderful museum. It's all free, folks. I talked to you many times about it. But we had a great lecture today by Tom and his associate, Curtis Copeland. And Curtis is out in the lobby signing autographs.
He is. Who knew?
Well, people are buying the books left and right here, Tom. Well, here's what I wanted to just start out with. Here's what I just want to start out with. The question is, what is a hillbilly? And is it a derogative term or is it a term of encouragement? And I just want to start out with this. I am a hillbilly. My family's all my family is all hillbillies. The dirt roads of these hills and valleys I live in. And I'll tell you something. I take exception to people who use that term in a bad way.
Yeah, it's all about context. It's about who's saying it and what their intent is.
Exactly, exactly. And so, you know, through the years, I have traveled, I've traveled extensively, but I'm proud of it. And there's so many reasons for that, Tom. But I love your book. You know, I've been, while you were talking, I was scanning through so many people and places in this book. I'm so familiar with them. And I just wanted to start out with one of them, and that is Vance Randolph. You know, I have his books. I followed his work for years. I know how he passed away, down in Arkansas. And on the Branson Show, our listeners love history. And so they know history of Ozarks. So we have often in the spring, when there aren't any shows or stars to interview on the Branson Show, we have often talked about history. And so this very spring, we did a long history series on Ozark Mountain Country, weeks long. And we talked to so many people here in town.
I'm not getting into that.
Great guy.
Oh, wonderful. And the file.
I'd love to do that.
You know, there was so much with her. We had to do 2 shows. We had to put
What a wonderful lady.
had to put it that one into 2 parts. We talked about Chick Allen. I mean, that whole thing. We had a portion of Chick Allen, his own voice on the show.
Really?
Yes. And so we deep into the show, and we love Ozark Mountain Country. But I wanted to just start out with Branson Centennial because he is a favorite of mine, and I can tell he's one of yours.
He is, and I think he's probably the preeminent person that is certainly by volume that collected so much information. He went right to the source. He was a little rough at times, but he told it, warts and all. And you know, I think he really respected the people, and he was just going to tell the whole story, and he did.
Yes, yes. Well, I want to read a little bit here from your book where you talk about Mr. Randolph. You say, if anyone knew and portrayed the hillbilly of Ozarks in a realistic style, it was Vance Randolph. His work was so well researched and presented with such honesty that it is hard to disagree with his judgments. Now that's true. If one chose to quibble, perhaps one could argue that Randolph was an outsider, even though he spent the bulk of his life living in the Ozark Mountains. You know, when you use that term outsider,
Outlander?
No, wait, is it?
I might have used either one. I like Outlander. It's not.
Well, okay, that word is interchangeable. That word is interchangeable. It can be outsider or outlander. But I just wanted to refer to that quickly here. In my family, you could have a neighbor that had lived down the dirt road from you for 50 years. They still weren't from here. It'll never be from here, you know. You gotta be born and raised to be from here, in my opinion. Anyway, back to Vance Randolph. He was just an incredible, unique, brilliant, probably a genius.
Yes, he was. I mean, he had a knack for getting to know people, and I think he developed a trust with him, so they would tell him just about anything. You know, maybe he occasionally embellished a little bit. I don't really care because he's got so much information. That's why I say that you just have to take it for what it is. And he covered so many great topics. We did music, recorded tons of music, sitting out on the front porch in the Ozarks, his body tales, just a lot of realism about the way of life here. Some really wonderful work. So,
yes.
And I'm glad he documented it. Without documentation, without writing it or recording it, it gets lost.
It does.
That's why I'm glad you guys are capturing some of this history, because if we don't document it, it may eventually go away.
Well, we just can't let that happen, y'all. We can't let that happen. You've got an actual photograph in your book of Vance Randolph recording Ozarks music, and this is on a porch somewhere, probably deep in a valley somewhere, with his recording equipment. And there's a guitar and there's a violin, and this is just amazing. I got to brag just a little bit here. Years ago, Tom, I went to a indoor garage sale in Springfield, and it was not huge. It was like an estate sale, but just boxes and stuff, and you just had to like sort through it, you know. I found a photograph, a real photograph, and it was autographed. It was of Vance Randolph with a cigar and a top hat, or not a top hat, and a bowler hat, a gray, really fancy bowler hat. It was black and white.
Right, he didn't have a pistol in his hand.
No, it was a cigar, and it was autographed, and it said, "From Vance Randolph to Macon McCord, from one hillbilly to another."
Wow.
And it was an 8x10, and I paid $3 for it. Well, now the next question is, where is that?
That's a whole story right there.
The next question is, where is that photograph today? Well, May Kennedy McCord had a grandson named Charles. And Charles went to my high school, he was a year older, and he flew the coop, so to speak, went to New York, and was the sidekick to Don Imus on the Don Imus show for decades.
Didn't know that.
Yeah, so one year around Christmas, he came home. And he came, and I had gotten a hold of him. And he came to my house to visit. And it hurt. I mean, you know, when you give something that you just treasure, you just love. But really, those are the best gifts. Those are the best gifts, the one you don't want to give away. I gave him that photograph.
Yeah, that's a wonderful, like I said, you know, pictures worth 1,000 words. And
Yeah.
the relationship between May and Vance, and the fact that you know, that both their names were on it, just interesting people. And May, in her own way, you know, really promoted the Ozarks. She really wanted to promote the Ozarks. And again, I think her stories are certainly from a woman's perspective, and maybe a little more milder than some of Vance's were. But she went to the source, and I think she told it like it was, and she was completely proud of that, and I respect that.
Yes, well, she was something else. She used her voice and her hillbilly image as a positive portrait of our people here, didn't she?
She did. I was fortunate enough to be able to interview May's granddaughter.
Oh, really?
And by phone, and so I felt like, you know, I had a pretty good source of information there.
Yes, yes.
And I think her granddaughter's recently published a book that is a collection of some of May's writings.
Oh, really? I
Probably
sure want to
mostly
see
from
that.
Hillbilly Heartbeats, and I'm not
Yes.
exactly sure. I think there's something out there.
Yeah. Well, now I was also reading here where Vance, we know that he recorded a lot of traditional music, and he said that there's at least, I think he said 44 versions of Barbara Allen. And you know, really in my family we call it Barbary Allen. And I have heard that there's like 400 versions of Barbara Allen.
Almost everybody's. You know, what's funny, in some of the musicologists like Randolph and Farmer and other people that recorded this, the traditional music, say that everybody they talk to says, the version that I played, that's the right version. And if anybody messes with that, they just don't know what the original version is. But everybody says that, and their version is a little different.
Well, it's real hard. I mean, over 100 years you pass this music down. But Barbie Allen, I mean, that's, if you can't play that, you need to quit trying to play Ozark Mountain music, because that's a big one.
Yeah. They buried Sweet William in the old courtyard. They buried Miss Barbara beside him, and out of her grave there grew red rose, and out of her was a briar. They climbed to the top of the old church tower. They hooked to the climbed together, the rose, and the briar. That's my version. That's probably the original version.
And that we'll just gonna declare that it is. Right here on this show, and I declare that it is. Well, I have another hillbilly story to tell you. This is years ago, probably back in the 70s. But I went to visit a friend in Chicago, and we'd gone out. She moved to the big city, and when we go up the driveway, the neighbor comes running out the door, and she says, "Are they here? Are they here?" And my friend says, "These were my friends I told you about." She said, "Well, they're not barefooted. I thought you said they were hillbillies." So, you know, I mean, that's an insult. That's an insult. And there's nothing wrong with going barefoot.
And it's ignorance in the way that she picked up that.
Yeah.
And maybe no fault necessarily of her own, but she picked it up from probably mass media. You know, and we try to capture that in our book. You know, where did this develop and how did it develop? And a lot of the negative, certainly less positive, stereotypes and images were really promoted in the writing and in the films, and even in the music. And unfortunately, we still do it to a certain extent to this day. We're kind of trying to set the record straight, provide an alternate age in our book, and try to say, you know, there's a more balanced view here. There's another side to the story if you look for it.
No more shares.
Well, when Curtis can join us, I want to ask him a question.
74 people.
Curtis,
Yes.
you got time?
I do. Is Gail sticking around a minute?
Yeah, I'll tell her.
Okay. Just have her bring it by and I'll see. Do you have time still too? Like 10 minutes? Okay. Hi. Sorry.
Good morning, Curtis Copeland to join us here. Curtis, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I'm loving this book.
We did learn something. It has been working well when somebody was not using a screen for the speaker up here, because
I
we
love
could add
this book,
chairs
Curtis, really, and I wanted to just mention something that you read at the last presentation. You said the Hillman matched his environment.
Perfect.
Almost perfect.
The Hillman matched his environment. And you know what? If he hadn't, he would have never made it here.
Tom, you
That's
couldn't
right.
see me, but I could see you.
They were great at adapting to their environment.
Yeah.
You know, being able to survive, isolated. You know, for a long time, even early in the 20th century, it's an isolated area.
Very.
You know, rugged hills and valleys.
I heard that the sheriff of Kane County, clear up until in the early 1950s, was still riding through the area on horseback.
A lot of the places to
You
get
couldn't get to, yeah.
had to be on horseback, right? Yeah,
Isn't that
absolutely.
amazing?
Mhm.
Well, the railroad passed us by, and so, you know, we weren't connected with what you might call civilization.
Right.
Yeah. Well, my family are all hillbillies. I mean, proudly hillbillies. And I've often thought, you know, imagine you've got a cabin that you built yourself, either log or rock. A lot of them are rock.
Mhm.
And the soil here is so thin.
Yeah.
And you plant your crop and you've got the corn and it's growing, but that year there's no rain. There's no rain. And what does come up is deer eat. And you've got a cabin with maybe how many little kids, you know?
Right.
What's a man gonna do? You know, what's he gonna do? And so don't be putting down the hillbilly around me, because I have heard about that bike, and I've seen part of it,
Mm-hmm.
and I just won't tolerate that.
Yeah, and that's the purpose of our book is to make sure that the positive aspects of the hillbilly character are remembered, kept in mind, and carried on.
Absolutely.
Because I've been called a hillbilly both as an insult and as a compliment. You know,
Yeah.
and that's kind of the
I
way
don't
we
think I've
are.
ever heard it as a compliment, you know, except when I'm around people who have family here that have made it,
That's
one way or the other, you know. And when you have that experience in your family, you know how to appreciate those hardships.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, hillbillies can call each other hillbilly and get away with it.
That's true.
And a lot of times,
Hillbilly.
yeah, and even if it's
That's
used
true.
as kind of name calling amongst us
Well, it can
hillbillies
be an
as friends.
affectionate
Yeah,
name calling too.
exactly.
though, you know.
And then if an outsider or somebody from outside the region tries to do a similar thing, it doesn't really work
No,
the same.
don't do that.
Yeah.
Don't do that. Well, I remember so much. I mean, you know, the no indoor plumbing, the wood cook stove, keeping the milk cold in the spring. You know, that day in the spring, down the dale. So many things. And the last thing I would ever do would be put those folks down, you know.
Absolutely.
To say anything derogatory.
Mhm.
We don't know how good we've got it, Chris.
Right.
We just don't know.
Yeah,
We
the good old days weren't always so good.
No. And I, you know what, I'm not so sure, but what a little hardship wouldn't do us good,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Right.
It might get our attention.
So where is your family from, or where
Well,
was this
I've
area?
got family in Berry County,
Okay, yeah.
Castle area, and Washburn area, and in fact, my great grandpa was Dr. Morgan.
Okay.
He was a cancer doctor,
Wow.
and people came from hundreds of miles away to be treated by him. In fact, he treated the James game one time.
That's some neat history there.
In a cave
Wow.
down there. Yeah, some great history. Well, you know what? I love this book. Just love this book, Curtis. And Tom's going to give us a way that folks can find out. Tom's going to give us a way folks can find this book. He said you can go online and email him. And I've got his email address here. Here it is.
Yes.
Okay. I've got his email address here because I think a lot of folks are going to want this book. It's WOL publish at gmail.com. Very easy. WOL publish at gmail.com, and you will be in touch with Tom. And the book is Ozarks Hillbilly.
Stereotype and reality. Yeah,
The
Ozarks Hillbilly, stereotype and reality.
And I love the fellow that you've got pictured on the cover. And you know something, one more thing about that, Curtis. He looks so familiar to me. I mean, I know I don't know him, but he's typical of the gentleman from that period who would wear dress pants, dress shirt, a hat.
Always a hat.
Always a hat, and it was a Stetson if they could get it.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's got a powder horn around his
Right.
neck, and
Yeah.
that must be a musket, a
Yeah.
powder musket that he's got.
It looks like a muzzle loader to me. And he was, like I said, Sam was a state representative, so he was a successful man, from McDonald County. We don't know a lot about him, but he certainly looks like a proud, strong character to me.
Well,
I just like the photo.
Oh, I think it's awesome, and that's on the cover. And my point about the clothing is, this was his dress-up clothes. These weren't his work clothes, you know.
Right.
In my
Usually
family,
it
that
was
would have been,
overalls.
yeah. In my family, that would have been his dress-up clothes, and he was posing for a photograph.
Right.
You know, isn't that sweet?
Yeah,
That's sweet.
yeah, usually overalls and so forth. So, about that musket and powder horn, a couple things. First of all, that's a photo taken by Vance Randolph.
Is it?
Yes. And so Sam was one of his informants when Randolph was living down there in McDonald County at Pineville. And probably a couple of things could be going on. Either Sam himself or his father, because that's kind of a Civil War era gun.
Yeah.
It's
Oh,
probably
yeah.
hand-me-down. Plus, you know, Pineville back in the 1920s, it's from the mid-1920s, that photo, was still remote enough that it's probably difficult to get ammunition. And
Probably.
so, you know, black powder and musket ball is probably more feasible because you can create that yourself.
Yes, you can make your own.
Versus store-bought ammunition.
Right,
So,
right. Well, I love your book, guys.
Thank
I
you very
appreciate your time
Yeah,
so
thank
much.
you.
And for our listeners, if you didn't have your pencil ready, here it is again. It's wolpublish@gmail.com. wolpublish@gmail.com. Ozarks City. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
You know, you're keeping so much alive that I love with all my heart. And I really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're
What
welcome.
did you miss a lot?
I know, I'm
You
sorry.
miss- Well, the one story you need to know is the photograph that I owned at one time. I'm really into Ozarks history. I mean, I've got the books. I've done we've done several series on my program
Really?
on Ozarks history and people, and you know, Violet Hensley and Bob May. They've all been on my show, and I've really got into Chick Allen. Spent a lot of time on Chick Allen this spring. But I at one time owned a photograph of Vance Randolph, a real one.
Really?
It was about this big, and it was in a sepia tone, and it was a headshot. And he had a cigar and dressed in a suit. He had a cigar and he had a bowler hat, a gray, really fancy looking bowler hat.
Yeah.
And looking into the camera. And the autograph was from Vance Randolph to May Kennedy McCord.
Wow.
From one hillbilly to another.
Isn't that something?
Wow.
I had that. I owned that. I paid $3 for
We could almost use that as a cover.
That's awesome.
it. So, you know, if he autographed that to her, there's more out there.
Yeah.
There's got to be. I mean, you wouldn't just do one.
Yeah, my favorite one is my favorite autograph picture that I've seen that Vance has out there. So, Cyclone, Missouri, there was one of his friends that lived out there, Lewis Kelly, just another old rural farmer guy, and he had a horse and wagon. So Vance thought it'd be really cool. See, Vance was trying to be an Ozarker. He was low. So his idea, he's going to ride around the Ozarks in his wagon.
Oh, yeah.
And so there's a pretty famous picture of him that shows Vance up there, you know, looking all macho with his hat and his cigar, and sitting there on the seat of the wagon. And all you can see of the horse is its behind. And a lot of those pictures, he made several copies, but one of them was to Lillian Short, who was married into the Dewey Short family of Atlanta. It says, "To Lillian, I'm the one on the left." I mean, this classic Vance style. But yeah,
Well, he was great friends with her and also with Rose O'Neill.
Oh yeah. He tried to help her with her autobiography, and then he got frustrated because Callista kept editing out everything. She's so worried about her sister's image that she would edit out all the stuff that
Rose was never worried about her.
No, she didn't care.
I wish, if there's one person I wish I could have met, it'd be Rose O'Neill.
Yeah. Her nephew, what's his first name?
David?
No.
Was it Paul?
Paul. Paul taught shop at Central High School when I went to Central High School.
Oh, wow.
And I was already into Rose O'Neill at that time. That's a long time ago. And so I was fascinated by him. But he's the one that came down and took the art out right before the fire.
Wow.
Paul O'Neill on that.
Huh.
And so it wasn't that, I don't know, maybe 20 years after that, he loaned that art collection to the Springfield Art Museum, just down the street from me in Springfield. And it was just mind blowing. that art. And of course, it's been dispersed then, so they sold it to this one and that one, and they didn't.
She had some unusual stuff.
Oh, it was incredible to see it. There was probably, oh, I don't know, there might have been 15 minutes there. He had it. Oh, he took, now some burned in the house, but he took the best.
I'm glad he did.
Just
It's
a
almost
few
like,
days.
It's almost like he knew that Uncle Clint couldn't be trusted.
Yeah, just a few days before the house burned, he got that art out. It was all, he taught shop in Central High School.
The story was that Clink, he's a little different character, and the house is so big that he'd get cold, so he would put hot coals on like a canvas or something and drag it from one fireplace to the other in the house, and that accidentally set it on fire.
That may be.
Yeah, that's one of the rumors anyway.
If you mentioned that you've done a series on history. I've got another book out, Buried by Table Rock Lake, which a lot of people find interesting because it's all the stories about what it was like before the lake. And the
You know,
people that,
we do this in January, in February. Could I get you up to come in the studio?
if you wanted to, I'm just throwing it out, if you wanted to do maybe a series on that book and some of those stories, I'd be interested. And Curtis is
Buried by.
he knows a lot more about a lot different stuff than
Yeah,
I do,
yeah.
so he's all over the place in Ozarks history.
Well, what happens in January and February, the show, the Branson show, is all about what you do in Branson when you come to Branson. I mean, we just did one on Wonderworks today, and it's the hay goods, and I mean, half the stars come in and we play music and all that.